They are a family of service.
If later on I'm to be associated with all three services, it'd be a very good idea to do an attachment to each one. I think it gives one a very useful experience, very useful experience of responsibility and discipline.
When their days of active service are over, they still have an important role to play.
We support you. That's the message that royal visits send to units on the ground.
Tonight, the military destiny of royal princes.
Harry, from the age of 4, was in love with military life. I remember Princess Diana, she had managed to get cut down camouflage uniform, and Harry loved dashing around with his beret and camouflage kit on.
We hear from officers who have served alongside the royals.
There have been many comments about Prince Charles and the Royal Navy, about him not being happy. That didn't come across. He was very popular with his crew. He came across as enjoying himself.
From the military mishaps.
Charles gave the orders to slip anchor. One of the two things you're meant to do when you command a ship is A, prang it, and B, lose your anchor.
To facing the realities of war.
I saw Atlantic Conveyor myself. She was a burning wreck. I mean, it was quite horrific.
Our job out here is to make sure the guys are safe on the ground. Now, if that means shooting someone and shooting at them, then we'll do it.
What will the future hold for the next generation?
Princess Charlotte is the interesting one here. We can assume, I think, that when the time comes, Prince George, Prince Louis will do some kind of military service. Maybe she'll be expected to as well.
The Second World War was a turning point for the British public and their relationship with the monarchy. As a child, the Queen saw her parents lead the way with a strong sense of duty and compassion. These experiences during that time have defined her reign.
She saw the devotion that the King and Queen, her mother and father, did to keeping the morale of the home front up, their visits to munitions factories, their visits to the East End when it was blitzed, and so on and so forth. And I think she's carried that sense of public duty throughout her reign.
The monarchy and the military are inextricably linked.
The military is almost the closest relationship the royal family have. This isn't a marriage of convenience, it's an affair of the heart.
And it's not only the Army, the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy as well. There's this very deep and personal interest in the capabilities, the morale of her armed forces.
I would say that second after her strong faith, her devotion to the military is pretty much as high as it gets in the Queen's list of priorities.
As sovereign, the Queen is Commander-in-Chief of the British Armed Forces and is actively involved in all branches of the military.
The Queen is head of all the armed services, of course, but under her, her husband before his retirement, her sons, and indeed grandsons and daughters, many of them have these honorary roles as honorary heads of the various regiments.
There is no executive role, but it's another dimension to this close connection between the armed forces and the royal family, the wider royal family, in addition to the monarch herself.
It's been noted that British soldiers tend not to say they're fighting for Britain. They tend to say they're fighting for the Queen.
In 1967, Prince Charles broke with tradition. Instead of enlisting in the forces, he went to university. 4 years later, he followed in his father's footsteps and joined the Navy in 1971. Charles
chose the Navy largely because of his father and his great-uncle, Earl Mountbatten. I mean, they both had distinguished careers, and he wanted to emulate those. There is a strong connection between the modern royal family and the Royal Navy, and it was almost inevitable that Charles would want to follow it.
The prince trained at Dartmouth Naval College before serving on the guided missile destroyer HMS Norfolk. And in 1974, he took to the skies and qualified as a helicopter pilot. Paul Henk spent a year serving alongside Prince Charles. He also trained the young prince in minesweeping techniques.
Prince Charles is a great pupil. He's very attentive. He's obviously very intelligent and could absorb the information. He took everything in his stride, and he's a good guy. If you wanted to go for a beer, he'd be one of the people who would be most enjoyable to go and have a pint with.
He was a decent bloke, and he was to some extent, which perhaps now is harder to believe. He was one of the boys. He didn't have great airs and graces. He was kind of normal, and he rolled his sleeves up and got on with things.
On the 9th of February 1976, the Prince took command of the coastal minehunter HMS Bonington for his last 9 months in the Navy. But it wasn't all plain sailing.
He was very seasick, and he would take a bucket if he was guiding the ship to be by him if the sea was rough.
Somewhere off the coast of North Wales, his anchor fouled on a communications cable, and it got completely trapped. They could not get it off. And in the end, Charles gave the orders to slip anchor. The one thing you're not meant to do, one of the two things you're not meant to do when you command a ship is A, prang it, and B, lose your anchor. And it was a black mark on his record.
Just one of those things, there was nothing that could be done. A quirk of fate, you know. I'm glad it was he that it happened to rather than us.
Charles would one day become head of the Navy, but back then he was still one of the crew, and as such wasn't exempt from the pranks. During a routine maneuver, they couldn't resist a joke at his expense.
I had an idea. I went down to the wardroom, got a bottle of grouse whiskey, and picked open the seal, the customs seal, took the top off, topped it up with cold tea, and sealed it again and sent it across as a gift to the Bonington. The diving officer said, "Sir, check the seal. You can't trust Hank." The seal was intact. So they opened it. Prince Charles came on the bridge wing, took a sip and spat it out, of course, because you don't expect cold tea in your whiskey. And the diving officer said, "I told you couldn't trust Hank, sir."
Commander Prince Charles served in the Navy for 5 years, and when his time came to leave the Bonington in September 1976, his crew gave him a memorable send-off.
He was wheeled out in a wheelchair as a sort of joke on his now aged self that was forcing him to retire. He also had a toilet seat around his neck. So, you know, perhaps another sign that, you know, when he's in and around the military, he's one of them and they don't treat him in any different way.
Charles is wreathed in smiles, slightly bemused by it all. He was assured that this was some ancient naval custom, but I think they were just having a bit of fun at his expense.
I think it was just as a joke. There was no purpose to it in reality. But he took it in good stead, as he did everything. They really had a great deal of liking and admiration for him.
Like his parents, Prince Charles understood the importance of serving and supporting the armed services.
If later on I'm to be associated with all three services, it'd be a very good idea to do an attachment with each one. I think it gives one a very useful experience of responsibility and discipline.
As a future king, he understood the roles of the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. I don't think that Charles ever loved the military in the way his sons did.
I think responsibility is the most important thing, is the actual trust that's put in you to deal with other people, and the feeling that they can perhaps put their trust in you as well.
There have been many comments about Prince Charles and the Royal Navy, and I've read a number of stories about him not being happy. That didn't come across. He was very popular with his crew. He came across as enjoying himself.
Prince Charles served in peacetime, but in 1982, just 6 years after he left the Navy, conflict was looming. The Queen, like many other mothers, would feel the anguish of having a son fighting on the front line. Britain was soon to be at war.
Andrew himself was determined to go, and he made it absolutely clear that if he couldn't go, he would resign his commission.
The bond between the royal family and the armed forces is strong. In times of conflict, the monarchy is looked to for stability and strength. But in times of peace, the royal family supports servicemen and women. Engaging with the military is seen as one of the principal duties of a member of the royal family.
Even after Prince Charles's own 5 years in the Navy finished, his connections never went away. When there were British troops serving in Bosnia, he went to visit them, and he asked the man on the ground whether there was anything they needed. So the officer said, well, the men would really like to be able to phone home at Christmas. Within a few days, the ministry had installed 6 satellite telephones.
I particularly remember in the first Gulf War, Prince Charles flew out to Saudi Arabia just before Christmas 1990 to spend time with the troops. And while he was doing that, Princess Diana flew to Germany, where those troops were based, to spend time with the soldiers' wives. And it was a sort of a joint effort. And it's the kind of way that the royals have approached their connection with the military over the years. And it means an awful lot to the troops on the ground that we're being thought about, we're not being forgotten about.
It's part of the encouragement. It's part of we're with you. It's part of we support you. That's the message that royal visits send to units on the ground.
All those people really are extraordinary, I think, and how much effort and dedication they put into it. So I just wanted to come say thank you and well done.
Unsurprisingly, the Queen takes a keen interest in her armed forces. She likes to be kept well informed of the goings-on.
You once or twice a year have an audience with the monarch, just the two of you. It is for you to report the good state and health of the army to the Queen, and she takes a personal interest. It's important to be well briefed. She knows her stuff.
The monarch's fondness for the military is clear, and the feeling is mutual. The military love their Queen.
We have a great deal of reverence and liking for our Queen and the royal family in general. And I think the Queen comes across very strongly as reciprocating that in her love of the armed forces. She's a great commander-in-chief. Although one doesn't know what advice she's giving to the admirals and the generals behind the scenes, but probably sage advice.
On April the 2nd, 1982, Britain went to war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands, a British territory in the South Atlantic.
This war at sea began for us at dawn on May Day. The ships of the task force had already crossed the perimeter of the total exclusion zone, that cordon sanitaire that both sides claim as their own.
The Queen's second son, Prince Andrew, was deployed.
Brazen's helicopter crew were preparing their own Falklands patrol, and its pilot was punctual for his briefing.
The British government was hesitant over the Prince's commission. The then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was concerned that the Prince's involvement would increase the danger to his fellow servicemen.
She didn't want him to go because she felt, and probably rightly, that the Argentinians would absolutely devote all their manpower in trying to kill him. And there was lots of rumours that we wait for the little boy royal to come out, very patronising comment, so we can get rid of him.
Andrew had joined the Navy 3 years before in 1979. He was fully aware of the dangers. Supported by his family, he was adamant he should go.
I don't remember any great groundswell of opinion against him going. On the contrary, I think people said, good on you.
We must remember that Andrew himself was determined to go, and he made it absolutely clear that if he couldn't go, he would resign his commission.
Prince Philip totally understood his son's point of view and agreed that, that he should go. And funnily enough, so did the Queen. She had obviously a mother's worries, but she understood that he really needed to go. And eventually, Margaret Thatcher agreed.
His Royal Highness, Prince Andrew. A lieutenant who calls himself simply the driver.
FCS, nulls, trims, set, lights on. Harnesses locked and tight at the back, please.
Along with his shipmates on HMS Invincible, Sub-Lieutenant Prince Andrew, as he was then known, sailed to the Falkland Islands to serve as a Sea King helicopter co-pilot.
His ship was part of the task force that was sailing to liberate the Falklands. It was well known that if Andrew had suffered, if he'd been killed or seriously injured, it could have had a dramatic effect on morale. And certainly the Argentine forces were convinced that if they had taken out Prince Andrew, they would have secured a huge blow against the might of the British Army.
The Prince flew dangerous missions. As with many other service men and women, What he saw during the war would affect him deeply.
He was involved in diversionary tactics, in troop movements. He was on the deck when an exocet was fired at the ship. So he was there, he was in danger.
He was flying above the Invincible. A bomb came towards it and then went off in another direction and hit another vessel, and 12 people were killed. And he saw this from above. It moved him terribly, and he felt just so unhappy and distraught by what had happened.
I mean, I think that a small missile, perhaps 18 feet long, can do that much damage. And I think we've all seen the photographs of HMS Sheffield and Atlantic Conveyor, or if not, I saw Atlantic Conveyor myself. She was a burning wreck. I mean, it was quite horrific.
On the 14th of June 1982, the war was over.
For the Queen, the Falklands conflict was very personal because Prince Andrew was serving down there. She was glued to the radio, she listened to the reports as they came in and watched the television each night. She had, of course, suffered a casualty in the Second World War. Her uncle had been killed on a training flight, and so she knew the price that war can pay.
During 3 months of fighting, the conflict claimed the lives of 255 British and 650 Argentinian servicemen. On the 17th of September 1982, HMS Invincible returned. Families gathered at Portsmouth to welcome home their loved ones. The royal family were no exception.
Prince Andrew was very good looking. He was a naval officer. I suppose in a way, he was a war hero. And there is a wonderful photograph of him arriving back from the Falklands, and he sticks a rose through his teeth. It was just wonderful, and people were cheering.
The prince was seen as a returning hero.
It was a fantastic moment. I mean, those homecomings, I remember them well, in 1982 were incredibly moving. There were big television occasions, cameras were all there, tens of thousands of people were there to welcome home our victorious sailors and troops.
They were screaming and shouting as if he was a sort of pop idol. She probably thoroughly enjoyed and thought he deserved.
Andrew Mania swept the country.
Andrew was then asked to turn on the Christmas lights in Regent Street, and apparently when he did so, that women sort of screamed and fainted at the sight of this gorgeous man.
At that time, Prince Andrew was seen as this dashing military figure, naval figure, who in a sense was the great action man of the royal family.
Having lived and served in the Royal Navy for the last 15 years, I hope it will serve me in good stead for the rest of my career and the rest of my life.
Andrew would have a challenger to that action man title. In 1986, his younger brother Edward signed up for the Marines.
Prince Edward, the baby of the Queen's children, if you like, he was desperately keen to follow in the footsteps of his two older brothers and join the military. And after coming down from Cambridge University, he announced that he was going to join the Marines. And a lot of us were incredibly impressed because of all the arms of the military to enroll in. The Royal Marines is probably the toughest. You know, was Edward cut out for it? Well, probably not.
Just 12 weeks into his training, the young prince shocked his family when he expressed doubts over his choice.
Slightly uncomfortable reality of the modern royal family in the military is that of Prince Edward. And in a sense, Prince Edward's whole story in relation to the military is a bit of a PR disaster.
Prince Edward wanted to be a Royal Marine from the age of 10. And unfortunately, he'd longed for it for so many years that when he actually joined the Marines, he found it very disappointing. He could not bear it that he had a police protection officer with him all the time. It made him feel very inhibited.
He got a scholarship to Cambridge, courtesy of the Marines. And I talked to him about his role in the Marines, and I also talked to a lot of the Marines, and you know, commanding officers, none of them could understand, really, why Prince Edward left so suddenly. He went home for Christmas, and during that time he decided, this is a waste of time, I don't want to do this anymore.
After a meeting with his brothers and sister at Buckingham Palace, The family thought they had persuaded him to complete his training.
Prince Edward spent the weekend with Andrew and his sister Anne at Buckingham Palace, and they all talked it through. And he said, OK, I'll go back and I'll finish the course. Princess Anne was driving back to Gatcombe Park, and she suddenly heard on the radio that Prince Edward had quit the Marines, and she practically put her car in a ditch because she'd only just left Buckingham Palace and he'd agreed that he would stay.
Prince Edward's father, Prince Philip, had a distinguished military career and was a great supporter of his children joining the armed forces. His reaction took everyone by surprise.
At the time, it was widely reported, erroneously as it turned out, that he'd engaged the wrath of his father, that he'd embarrassed him somehow because he had this highly symbolic role with the Marines. In fact, Prince Philip was anything but embarrassed. He was enormously sympathetic, and he later made it clear that he thought his son's decision had been extremely brave because he wasn't like any other young officer dropping out of a course. He was the Queen's son. The world knew about it.
The Queen was absolutely shocked and very, very cross. Prince Charles was very cross, but the Duke of Edinburgh, who'd loved the Navy, felt if he didn't like it, he didn't like it. So, surprisingly, he took the line of least opposition. But many of the senior royals felt he'd let the royal family down, which was very difficult for him.
And his father was commander-in-chief, his mother's the head of the armed forces. I mean, it takes a bit of doing to say, I want out.
The fact that he didn't even complete the training, I think for some people does leave a little bit of a bad taste, or at least a humorous smile on people's faces.
The senior royals' time of service had come to an end. It was now the turn of the next generation, William and Harry, to carry on the military tradition. Another prince would put their life on the line.
There have been a number of specific threats, some reported, some not reported, which relate directly to Prince Harry as an individual.
The Queen's grandsons, William and Harry, are passionate advocates for our armed forces, and both have made careers for themselves in the military.
Prince Charles's sons, from a very early age, loved anything to do with soldiers and military, and there's delightful photographs of them dressed in army fatigues and their little uniforms.
Don't forget, they would be living in a palace and there would be soldiers outside. All these things were second nature to them. They used to play soldiers a lot when they were little.
For Harry in particular, the military seems to have been a calling from very early on.
Harry, from the age of 4, was in love with military life. I remember photo calls with Princess Diana when he was that age, and she had managed to get cut down fatigues, army fatigues.
He was given a mini outfit, and he did not take it off until it almost fell apart.
Harry loved dashing around with his beret and camouflage kit on. And Princess Diana knew long before he joined the army that he was destined to go into the military.
Princess Diana took him to see the British regiment in Germany, and he just said it was one of his happiest days. He just loved it. He sat on a tank. So he was actually imbued with it from a very early age.
As Harry grew older, his yearning to serve his country only grew stronger. And even at school, he joined the combined cadet force. He rose quickly through the ranks and eventually achieved Eton's highest cadet position.
He wanted to actually do something, make a contribution, and military life hugely appealed to him.
And he joined Sandhurst. He took his training very seriously, and so it was there really that he, I suppose, began the process of, probably he would describe it now, that he's being much more open about his own mental struggles after his mother's death. He probably found the first time he could really relax.
But for all of the sense of belonging, the rigorous regime of Sandhurst proved a challenge for the fun-loving prince.
Every morning at 5 a.m., the trainees had to be outside their room with everything looking immaculate inside. And Prince Harry found this quite difficult because he said he was used to coming home at 5 a.m. from nightclubs and not getting up at 5 a.m.
Prince Harry referred to those 44 weeks of training at Sandhurst as some of the toughest of his life. He complained that he was treated like dirt. What he meant was that he was treated like everyone else. But I think actually they were some of his happiest times as well, partly because he wasn't treated as HRH, Prince Harry. He was treated as an ordinary person.
On the 13th of April 2006, aged just 21, Harry graduated from Sandhurst.
The Queen looked absolutely delighted to see the first of her grandchildren pass out at Sandhurst. That would have been an enormously proud moment for her, not just as a grandmother, but the head of the armed forces. Because he was passing out, he wasn't meant to smile at the Queen, but I think Harry almost couldn't help himself. There was just a hint of a smile on his face, but actually realising that childhood ambition of being a soldier, you know, that was fantastic.
I know that everyone here today has been deeply impressed by your smartness and bearing on this parade. This is just the end of the beginning, and many of you will deploy on operations within months or even weeks.
Following his graduation, Harry joined up with the Blues and Royals Regiment as an officer cadet. He was determined to get to the front line, but in 2007, his request was denied.
The British Army took the decision that it was simply too dangerous to send him to Iraq. They had received some intelligence that he was almost certainly going to be targeted.
There have been a number of specific threats, some reported, some not reported, which relate directly to Prince Harry as an individual.
It was felt that they could not protect him when they had a job to do. It was going to take too much manpower.
If they said, no, you can't go front line, then I wouldn't drag my sorry ass through Sandhurst, and I wouldn't be where I am now, because the last thing I want to do is have my soldiers sent away to Iraq or wherever like that, and for me to be held back home, twiddling my thumbs thinking, well, what about David, what about Derek?
A year later, a new chapter began in his military career.
At the time of the Afghan war, Harry was in the military, and he obviously bullied his superiors, constantly saying, I want to be deployed. I want to be deployed when my unit is deployed. And when his unit was deployed, Harry said, you know, this is it. I want to go with my men.
This was very complicated because he was a vulnerable young man, and they felt that if he didn't go, he would go right off the rails as he had done earlier. And Lord Dunnet, who was head of the military at the time, and the Queen would have long discussions about what to do with Prince Harry.
General Lord Dunnet had a series of quite intense conversations with Harry, who he found a very intelligent and persuasive young man, and who really explained to him in quite emotional terms how he really had no future in the army if he could not serve and go with his men.
Through Harry's insistence, the decision was eventually made to let him go to Afghanistan, but it was to be top secret.
In order to get him out to Afghanistan, it was realised that the press would have to cooperate, because any serviceman who came back could potentially sell their story.
Sir Dunnet, who was head of the army at the time, called a meeting of the Fleet Street editors at the Ministry of Defence. It was really exciting. It was like going into a Bond movie. We went through all these security checks, and in comes Dunnet, who was absolutely charming. And he laid out a plan, and he talked us through it and what would happen. He said Harry would be sent out there, but it would be completely secret. It had to be, because he would have been a target for the Taliban.
And it was one of those rare occasions when the British press and broadcasters actually stuck to their guns, and they kept silent about it. And Harry was able to go off with his troops of the Blues and Royals Regiment into Afghanistan.
Cornet, Wales taking on the Taliban.
On the right.
Action man images of the Prince on the front line, filmed with the approval of the MOD, with an assurance they'd not be shown until he's safely home or word of his deployment leaked out.
Harry had been a restless spirit before he joined the army. There was a sense, really, that he was a reluctant royal, and then that he found his feet in the army. He knew that he could be anonymous, and he describes, you know, when he put on the military uniform, that he was just like everybody else. He was an equal.
In 2008, 10 weeks into Harry's tour, news was leaked that he was fighting on the front line.
Unfortunately, the deployment, which was meant to last for, I think, 20 weeks. After 10 weeks, his cover was blown. An Australian magazine published the fact that he was out there, and the army immediately extracted him because they felt that he would almost certainly become a target. Bin Laden had said that their intention was to kill him.
There were very specific threats being made. There'd be a bounty on his head. And of course, that isn't just a question of his danger. That would have put those immediately around him in particular danger as well.
He had 1 hour to pack up and get out, but they wouldn't tell him why. They just said, "You're going," and he was flown out. And it was only when he was out of Afghanistan airspace did they tell him why.
This wasn't the day he expected or wanted to come back, but back he had to come, and quickly.
I remember going to Bryce Norton that day when he came back, and he was furious. I mean, he was absolutely spitting because he was loving his time there. It was probably the happiest he'd been in his adult life. He'd really found his vocation.
I didn't see it coming. It's a shame. As I said, angry, probably the wrong word to use, but no, I'm slightly disappointed. I thought I could sit through to the end and come back with sort of our guys and the Colonel himself.
There was no doubt. I mean, this was perhaps not the beginning, but certainly added greater intensity to his already loathing, really, of the media. I mean, this had really scuppered his chances. So it was a really difficult circumstance for Harry, and also quite surprising, perhaps, that 5 years later, he then went on a second tour of Afghanistan. He was absolutely determined that that was not going to be it for him.
Harry wasn't ready to give up on active service. Training as a helicopter pilot allowed him to get back to Afghanistan in 2012.
The conflict in Afghanistan dragged on and on and on, and Harry was able to retrain as an Apache helicopter pilot and be deployed for a second time and go back out there in an entirely different role, this time flying helicopters.
That hurt, being pulled out at that point, being dragged away from my guys. I think it was all done. It wasn't done in the wrong way, but it was just.
We really did see how Prince Harry, who since has spoken so freely about his own mental health issues, about the traumas of his past, we really saw how he found himself in the army. First, just in being allowed to serve alongside everybody else. Second, more importantly, in being allowed to go and take part in active combat in Afghanistan.
Oh, there it is!
The most amazing thing, I suppose, is being in the tent 1 minute playing PlayStation, thrashing the guys at FIFA, and then running out here, jumping in the cab, and the only time you know where you're going to be or what you're going to be doing is when the information comes on the radio. And even then, sometimes, you still don't know what's going on. And it's only when you get up to, a couple of 1,000 feet above the target area that you start having a bit of information about what's coming back.
For Harry, the army served as a welcome break from his life of royal privilege.
You don't get a free pass, no matter who you are. And, if the army didn't think that they could get me out here, then they wouldn't have put me in here, because it costs a hell of a lot, as you can imagine, to train people up. And my seat would have been taken by somebody else. Simple as that.
Harry later revealed he had killed Taliban insurgents whilst piloting his Apache helicopter.
Our job out here is to make sure the guys are safe on the ground. Now, if that means shooting someone and shooting at them, then we'll do it. Out here at the moment, things are very different to what they used to be. Nine times out of 10, we get there, the damage has been done to the guys on the ground, so all our job is to make sure that nothing else happens. The Chinooks in, out, job done.
After his 4-month tour of duty in Afghanistan, Harry returned back to the UK in 2013. Having served for 10 years, he was torn between his military career and his royal duties.
When Prince Harry came home, he was offered a job in an office doing more military work. And he told me how much he hated sitting in front of a computer. He's an action man.
In 2015, Harry left the military, but he had a new project in his sights that would ensure he's never far from his armed forces family. With William and Harry both serving in the military, there was bound to be some healthy competition between them.
How much inter-service rivalry is there between you two?
None at all.
No, not at all, really.
I mean, everyone knows the Army's better than the
I'm a
RAF.
cavalry boy anyway, so it's fine. There's good bands between Army pilots and RAF pilots, obviously, as well. And the Naval pilots just, in the background, they didn't do anything, so it's fine.
This rivalry began back when they started their military training. As the eldest and heir to the throne, William was expected to lead the way, but at Sandhurst, Harry enjoyed a taste of seniority and the chance to pull rank on his older brother.
Prince William went to university before he went to Sandhurst. Harry skipped the university side of things and went straight into Sandhurst. So actually, William followed for once in Harry's footsteps. And, Harry joked that William was going to have a hard time. And not only did he have these grueling 44 weeks of training to get his head around, he was also going to have to address his brother as Sir and in a senior rank, which I would imagine for Prince Harry was probably a pretty happy moment in his life, having always been in the shadow of his brother.
William continued to follow in his younger brother's footsteps by joining the Blues and Royals Regiment of the Army in 2006. He hoped to be considered for active duty in Afghanistan, like Harry, but he was denied.
The heir to the throne was destined for very different routes from other members of the Queen's family. They are future monarchs. Their lives cannot be put in danger.
The question of whether the heir to the throne or near offer should be allowed to do active service has gone on being a hot topic. And that really did shape the nature of his involvement, because it was clear there was a lot he couldn't do in the army.
Whilst serving in Afghanistan, Harry sympathised with his brother's frustrations.
There is a bit of jealousy, not just the fact that I get to fly this, but obviously he'd love to be out here, and I don't see why, to be honest with you, I don't see why he couldn't. His job out here would be flying the IIT or whatever, doing Chinook missions, just the same as us. No one knows who's in the cockpit. Yes, he gets shot at, but if the guys who are doing the same job as us are being shot at on the ground, then I don't think there's anything wrong with us being shot at as well.
While William couldn't go to war as such and fight on the front line in the same way as Prince Harry, what was very important was that he had an experience across the armed forces. Being a future king, he will one day be the head of the armed forces. So of course he had that time with the army when he was working on a reconnaissance unit with the Blues and Royals.
Put the weapon down! Put the weapon down!
But he also spent time working with the Royal Navy, where he was sent overseas. And of course, the longest part of his military career was with the RAF.
We had a varied career, as it were. He did recover the body of an English serviceman from Afghanistan. And we also know that he was involved in a raid on a boat in the Caribbean that was carrying cocaine.
William returned to the RAF in 2009 to focus on search and rescue missions. He underwent helicopter flight training and became a full-time pilot. This was to be his last role within the military.
I think he enjoyed some of the happiest years of his life at RAF Valley in Anglesey, flying Sea Kings.
He wouldn't have wanted to be sitting at home pushing papers around an army desk. He shifted into the search and rescue department, which is a very interesting choice because it's not one that's involved in combat. It's still part of the military umbrella, but it's more of a helping role.
He wanted to serve. He wanted to be able to look one day his subjects in the eye and say, I also served for Queen and country. That was really important to him. Well, he had a very successful career. until 2013, when his military career came to an end.
After leaving the services, both princes embarked upon projects that were shaped by their military experiences.
It is interesting that both Princes William and Harry went into the services with enthusiasm, did well there. Both of them, though, have taken that in a particular direction.
Having seen firsthand the physical and emotional traumas of war, Harry made a commitment to veterans and their welfare.
While Harry made that decision to leave the army, his connection with the military, with the armed forces, was never going to be something that he gave up. He'd seen too much, he'd experienced so much in Afghanistan, and in fact it was on that flight home after his second tour of Afghanistan, when he came back with severely injured servicemen and women, that he decided that while he might be quitting the army, he could still do something to help injured servicemen and women, veterans, the people who'd given up their lives to fight for their country.
Prosthetics, dogs, wheelchairs, high-performance cars, 4x4s. We've got everything here. It can only be the Invictus Games.
In 2014, Harry launched the inaugural Invictus Games, an international sporting event for wounded, injured, and sick service personnel.
Sport has proven to have a hugely positive effect on the rehabilitation of these guys. We want to try and get as many of these service men and women back into society, giving them jobs and making sure that all the core values that they've been taught in the services to make them amazing, wonderful, strong, inspirational people, that they bring it back into the community.
Harry's done many things with his life since leaving the army, but I would say that the Invictus Games is his greatest legacy, and certainly one of the most important to him. It really means everything.
In a sense, it's this perfect vehicle for Harry, because it is a way in which he can be both a man of the military and a royal, and it was that was this real tussle for him. And he's respected by the military, both for what he's done with the Invictus Games, but also because he has had, experience in armed conflict as well.
Flying search and rescue helicopters, flying with the air ambulance, saving lives, has given these young men a sense of self-purpose, a sense of importance. It's enabled them to forge a career and a meaningful role for themselves whilst being members of the royal family. And I think for both of those princes, that has been the making of them.
It's almost as if they are combining the legacy of their two parents. Because traditionally, we've thought of military service as being about the least touchy-feely thing you can think of, as being all about the stiff upper lip that used to represent the old-style royal family. But they seem to have found a way of combining two different aspects at once.
The relationship between the monarchy and the military is constantly evolving, and the issue of whether members of the royal family should serve on the front line will continue to be debated.
Who knows what the royal family is going to look like in a decade's time? Will Prince George follow in his fathers and his uncles and his grandfathers and great-grandfathers and great-great-great-grandfathers' footsteps by going into the military?
Princess Charlotte is the interesting one here. Now she takes her place in terms of succession to the throne. Well, maybe she'll be expected to serve alongside everybody else as well.
I think if the royal family continue in the vein that they are, then there's every chance, because when you have a royal family, you have to have that connection with the armed forces. They are synonymous, they are intrinsic, they are part of the package together.
Perhaps what William and Harry have done with their military service, taking it and then developing it in more of a modern direction, if you like, the direction of care and helping. Perhaps that paves the way for the military and the monarchy ahead.